I just want to make very few remarks, really, just to make 2 points very briefly before others come in, as well as the roles that John just mentioned that I played. Something that you probably won't find in my Wikipedia page or any official bios of me anytime soon is the role that I played in the battles in a parliamentary sense over Brexit from 2016 to 2019. Along with a couple of other colleagues, I coordinated the Labour pro-Europeans, and that has given me substantial opportunity to reflect on the question of populism, its functioning in the UK, and reflections on populism elsewhere. As I say, I just want to make 2 points about what, from a UK parliamentary perspective, in discussion with colleagues, I think that we have learned. So what is populism and what is the populist? Well, a simple definition is a politician that is an outsider, somebody who defines themselves against the elite. But I think that's actually a really poor definition and doesn't describe certainly what I saw happening around me in British politics. Because I think lots of politicians consider themselves to be an outsider and define themselves against an elite, whatever that means, even if it's just an elite who've got like more money than the average person. I think there's lots of people in politics who would sort of roughly describe themselves in that way. I think populism, certainly in the UK, took a much nastier turn. And I think populism has at its heart a desire to divide and to create a sense of the other, that the problems that we have in society are not our problems, they're not shared problems, they're not ones that our government has created or that our society can fix. They're the problems of those people over there, however you define that kind of manufactured enemy. And that's the kind of populism I feel like I've lived with over the past sort of half decade or so. So how do you respond to that populism? Well, John's mentioned already the kind of the war on the truth, and obviously that there ought not ever to be any compromise about the truth in politics. But I think that's a general sense that I have. If you appease populist viewpoints, if you try and say yes, of course, you know, and appease those populist views to try and curry favour, I don't think you get anywhere. I think you challenge the populist with an analysis of the real problems that people in your country face, the real problems that they share, and proper answers to those problems. Now, that's a kind of politician's way of saying, you know, whatever it is that people need, we have to be on their side and fighting for them. That might seem obvious, but when, for example, when it comes to Brexit, there are all sorts of reasons why you know, the discussion that we had wasn't necessarily of good quality, or you know, all kinds of reasons that we could point to around the referendum or things that happened. But actually, I always felt we were on our strongest territory and making our best case when we were doing what in politics I think Labour, Socialist and Social Democrat politicians should do, which is to fight for people's jobs, for the money in their pockets, for their aspirations and for the things that they need. And I think that, you know, I think certainly if I look at what's going on in the local elections right now and in the national elections in Wales and Scotland, I think that's the ground we're on, and we are making a strong case because of it. My second point is about institutions. I was absolutely inspired by the US election, and whilst Joe Biden is kind of an inspiring person in many ways, personally, you know, as his life is kind of inspiring, the people who most inspired me in the US election were the state officials, absolutely determined in the face of a populist president who would do absolutely nothing legal, you know, breaking the law or otherwise. He would nothing was off the agenda for him in terms of keeping hold of the power that he had. And it was inspiring to see state officials and local officials in the US stand up for a well-functioning democracy. Now, it is the case that politicians are often quite soppy, and I have on occasion shed a quiet tear in a election count, watching the votes come in and feeling the great blessing of living in a country where everybody gets a vote, they all get counted equally, the result is declared fairly, and everybody accepts the result. And seeing the US officials do that and stand up against incredible pressure on them to do otherwise was utterly inspiring. And it also reminded me much of what I learned through the Brexit process, which is that in politics, sometimes you can't do everything that you want to do. You can't achieve every policy change that you want. But even if you do nothing other than make the institutions you're a part of work better, you're still doing something. I think that the Brexit process revealed many of the inadequacies of the House of Commons, and it made me more determined to try and have a system in the UK that works better, where we have better participation in our public institutions, where they're more inclusive, where we listen to difference in a better way, and where we're more transparent about decisions that are being taken. Because I think if we look at the journey from populism that I hope we're now seeing, as John described, I think that the way we make our institutions more robust and able to better serve the countries that they're in will mean that as and when, I mean, populist figures will appear in the future too, as and when that happens, we're better able to challenge them and to limit the damage they do. Finally, on institutions, the bad Brexit consequences that we are seeing, and I won't touch on Northern Ireland because that's a complex situation in and of itself, but the bad Brexit consequences that we're seeing is because economies function well because they have political and social institutions that can provide stability for those economies to grow and develop. And Brexit essentially is a massive disruption of those institutional relationships. What that means is if we want to do what I think we should do as politicians on the left and serve the public, get them jobs, homes, and help them fulfill their ambitions, is that those institutional relationships desperately need to be repaired. So I think the challenge for us in UK politics is to figure out how to limit the damage now and continue to build institutions of cooperation with our friends and partners in Europe, absolutely, but around the world, so that we can really generate those practical answers to people's problems in a way that I think is the proper answer to the populist.
Alison, perhaps I could just sort of come back at you on a couple of things there. The strategy of, apparent strategy of the Conservative Party is to create an ongoing series of culture wars around the aftermath of Brexit and various things like flags, funerals, whatever, to turn it into divisive issues. Now, there is a dilemma for people who are instinctively social liberal, and Labour has over the years made great gains in those fields in terms of personal rights and so on, as to whether or not you, as to how to deal with this, because a culture war we have seen in the US is one where, generally speaking, the left of centre loses. And at the moment, I feel that we're falling constantly into those elephant traps.
Thanks, John. And I think you make a really good point. And I think the culture war tactic of the populists that we're seeing is what makes me think that the Conservative Party is not ready to, arguably Boris Johnson is a sort of populist politician, and the culture war aspect of it makes me think that all the more. I suppose, again, for me, it's about practical solutions to practical problems. In answer to that, I don't think that we help our cause by getting into meaningless debate. And let me give a practical example of what I mean by that. In the UK, we've seen, following Black Lives Matter kind of movement and events following the death of George Floyd in the US, there's been a discussion about particular statues and cultural artifacts associated with slavery. Now, the government seem to have seized on this as, you know, as a moment in the culture war. Actually, in Merseyside, where I'm from, we have the International Museum of Slavery, where professional curators over many years have worked with the Black community, people from all over the world who happen to live in Merseyside, to curate a fantastic museum that captures the role of our city in slavery, and tells that story, tells that full story about the past in a way that that helps people understand who they are. Now, we in Merseyside, we didn't perhaps have quite so much of the angst about it, because that practical work has been done over the years. So I suppose my appeal, or my request would be, definitely don't fall into the culture war trap. Don't feel like you have to defend yourself against those on the right who will try and provoke and poke at us to get a reaction. On the other hand, have faith and confidence in good public service, that if we do the right thing by the public, that we can answer those narratives, because the practical doing of whether it's, you know, enabling people to understand their history, or whether it's in a practical sense on you know, social progress issues, enabling all kinds of families to be supported and accepted in our society, and, you know, not kowtowing to any people on the right who would want to sort of poke a stick at some kinds of families. I think if we trust ourselves that we've got good practical answers, then we need not jump into those elephant traps, John. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question. Apologies.
No, that was terrific. And the only other point I'd just put back to you is, if democracy is broken, where do we start fixing that? Or we're having an agenda to fix that becomes a tool towards power? Or is it simply a bubble issue?
Yeah, my answer to those sorts of questions is always doors. Go and knock some doors. If you think democracy is broken, go and talk to some people. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, that hasn't been possible. But I have to say, for Labour colleagues in the UK who've been able to be out and talking to people on doorsteps over the past couple of weeks, the welcome has been very, very warm. And I think that's partly because people have been quite lonely. And the idea of engaging with politicians is like, whereas normally it might be like, oh, politicians, at the moment it's like, frankly, I'll talk to anybody. But what I take from that is that if we think democracy is broken, we should try and make it work, try and get people together. I'm very interested, and you know, during the Brexit nightmares that we had, one of the things that I would have really loved to have done was to let's have a proper process about how we move on from here. Let's use citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies to have a proper facilitated discussion about where the country should go in a way that brings people together, not drives them apart. And so it might sound a boring process answer, but actually some of these processes that make democracy work well get you to a better political answer. And so if democracy is broken, it's our job as politicians and people who care about politics to make it work. And that involves listening and then bringing people together.